Hey friends, welcome back. So today we are continuing on with the PMDD 101 series. Last week we were talking about why should we have a period at all? Is it worth all of the effort and all of the work? Because there are some options. Some of them are extreme, but to actually just shut it down, shut down the hormones, shut down the cycle, and essentially just try to ignore it and do away with it. So last week I was sharing a lot of reasons that aren't often talked about of why we might want to weather the storm of the cycle. Not just weather it, but look for and fight for better information and alternative ways of treating PMDD. But today we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty of what is PMDD, how is it different from a hormone imbalance? Can you have PMDD and a hormone imbalance? And make it real fun and confusing about what's going on with our bodies, right? And I want to start with the concept of PMDD being PMS on steroids or like an extreme version of PMS. This is often how it is described or people talk about it. And it can be, a helpful way to kind of to create an analogy or try to give someone a sense of what your experience is. But I think it's really it's a misnomer and it doesn't actually help us understand what's happening underneath. And I even think that our concept of PMS is so varied. There is not a very clear definition of PMS. There's a lot of things that fall in that umbrella. And so, one person's idea of extreme versus another, we don't have the same language and experience to really have that be that useful. But the reason I think that it's a misnomer is because they aren't the same at the root. So PMS, if you think of it as a line, right? If you're like, okay, there's a spectrum and at some point you hit PMDD, it's like, okay, how bad does it have to get before we call it something different? But that's not actually how we're distinguishing between the two. If you have PMS, and so maybe that's anything that falls within the window of feeling different before your cycle or before your period starts. If that's the low end of PMS, okay, feeling a little bit low, maybe being a little bit more teary, but not that disruptive, right? So if that's the low end, when you get more and more extreme with PMS, where you're going is towards a hormone imbalance, which is not the same thing as PMDD. A hormone imbalance has to do with producing too much or too little of important hormones that are present in the body, whereas PMDD is actually referring to differences in how the body is responding to or metabolizing those hormones. So it's not the same process at play. And so I think when we convolute them, it just gets a little bit messy for people who are like, is it bad enough? Because again, our only really metric for this in day-to-day life is we're constantly comparing, right? Where it's oh, well, maybe my period is worse than this person that I know, but it's better than this other person, so maybe it's not that bad. So we're really, judging severity based on the people that we know and the people in our circle. And that often isn't helpful, especially if you're looking at your family history. And a lot of these things around our cycles can be genetic or a genetic component involved. And so it's oh, well, my sisters and my mom and my aunts and everyone that I know that I've talked about periods with have this problem, so it must be normal, right? So we need a little bit better definitions and criteria in order to understand where does this line cross. Now, when it comes to PMDD or premenstrual dysphoric disorder, by definition, it is a hormone-based mood disorder with symptoms arising during the premenstrual or luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. So starting somewhere post-ovulation and then subsiding or ending within a few days of menstruation. And so this time component is part of the diagnostic criteria, because if this is becoming just a chronic, this is always the case, then it's probably not, your cycle. We want to make sure that it's tied to the cycle if we're going to call it this hormone-based mood disorder. Now, in reality, it can feel as though symptoms extend beyond this time-bound window, and this can be the result of preemptive anxiety to the lead up of luteal. oftentimes, like when you've been dealing with PMDD for a long time, there can be a lot of anxiety and fear around like it's coming, it's getting close, and that can cause emotional and cognitive distress. Another thing is that luteal, especially the more that we resist those symptoms and the more intense that they feel, this can create an emotional or nervous system burnout that lingers post, day 1 or 2 of our cycle. And this can just be from having a bad PMDD month. It can also be increased environmental stresses or triggers that you have experienced, maybe, interpersonal, like in relationships, work stresses, even good stress like travel and things like that can maybe put a heavier burden on our nervous system and lead to a harder month. And then we feel like exhausted afterwards. But I think too, it's important, like as we start to navigate our own experience of PMDD, is to kind of understand what is PMDD and what is almost like a side effect of PMDD. Like, what is the core criteria and the core experience, and then how is that experience impacting me and maybe creating a snowball effect of other things that aren't actually, it's not like a PMD symptom, it's a PMDD like down the line domino implication, but it's not actually like the core, criteria. And the reason I think that is helpful is because it allows us to start to approach the PMDD problem, right? And considering like the distress and emotional symptoms that we feel, we can start to look at it from multifaceted ways of like, okay, well, what if I can ease like this experience or that experience? And it allows us to have more flexibility and lead from a little bit more intuitive place of like, what does my body like want to work on? What feels like it would really just free up some space and capacity for me if I just could soften the edge of this one portion of it. So when we break it down, I think that makes it more manageable because it's like, okay, I can do something about this piece. Maybe the whole thing feels overwhelming, but if I can just address this one little piece, we're going to start to build on that momentum and build capacity to take on more parts of the problem. PMDD is included in the DSM, so there is a formal criteria that needs to be met in order to be diagnosed, formally diagnosed. But it's this sort of criteria that is based on you tracking your symptoms for 2 or more months. That's how we get the data to then look at, does this match the criteria? And I'm just going to quickly give you an overview of that just because you don't need to Google another thing, you can, but I'll just give you an overview of what that criteria looks like. So according to the DSM, PMDD can be diagnosed if then the majority of menstrual cycles, at least 5 symptoms in one category must be present in the final week before your period, and then improve with the onset of menstruation and be like minimal or absent the rest of the cycle, right? So it wants it to be like, okay, there's a clear like onset and offset of these symptoms. So this would include things like mood swings, feeling suddenly sad or tearful, increased sensitivity to rejection, or marked irritability and anger, increased interpersonal conflicts, depression, hopelessness, self-deprecating thoughts, anxiety, tension, and a feeling of like being on edge. So it would be 5 in that category and then 1 or more symptoms in this next category, which would be like decreased interest in usual activities, subjective difficulty in concentration, so that kind of brain fog and cognitive change, feeling much more fatigued, lack of energy, changes in appetite, so overeating, having specific food cravings. Also, it can be a lack of appetite there as well if you're dealing with hypersomnia or insomnia, and just an overall sense of like overwhelm and feeling out of control. And there can also be physical symptoms there present, like breast tenderness, muscle pain, bloating, all of those things. But importantly, they really are focused on the severity of these things, because you may have listened to that and be like, okay, well, I think a lot of people could claim like feeling more tired, having a change in appetite, feeling a little bit more depressed, and maybe a little bit more irritable. Like all of those things can also apply with PMS, but really we're looking at the severity and that onset offset. So the severity here is that these things are having significant distress or interference with work, school, social activities, relationships with others, like that this is having a distinct impact on your life. And then, of course, there's an element here of ruling out other psychiatric disorders, other hormone imbalance issues that may be present. And that's where hormone testing comes in. So there's no test to say you do have PMDD, but testing can be valuable in the process of a formal diagnosis in order to rule out a hormone imbalance that may be actually the root of the problem, as opposed to PMDD, where it's like the way that you're metabolizing these hormones, the way you're reacting to normal levels of hormones is abnormal. And the reason why they want to look at other psychiatric disorders and make sure that you have this clear onset offset with your cycle is because these hormones can also exacerbate existing conditions. And there's a term in the research called PME, or premenstrual exacerbation, that refers to this. So like if you've already been diagnosed with anxiety, depressive disorder, panic disorder, personality disorder, these other psychiatric things, and then you're feeling those symptoms get more intense or worse as you approach your cycle, but they're present the whole month, then this is often thought of as like this is exacerbating an existing problem. So that's still the root cause, but it's interacting with hormones, as opposed to PMDD, where those symptoms are minimal or non-existent, and then there's a clear onset. So I really feel like there's more of kind of this like Jekyll and Hyde feel towards PMDD, where you're like, I feel like I'm this one person and I like this person. I feel very capable. Like this is who I recognize, I know, and then becoming like a different type of person in luteal or in that week before your period that just feels like a very distinct shift in who you are. So I think it's really helpful to have these definitions and this criteria to help you look at your own symptoms, especially if you've been tracking for a little while, to notice those shifts and changes and be like, okay, this does match, my profile of symptoms, or it doesn't. But I also think that Googling like PMS versus PMDD is a lot like, Googling, am I about to start my period or am I pregnant? Where the symptoms can have like so much overlap that it can feel hard to say like, okay, but how much of this is like normal fluctuations to my hormones and I just don't like it versus like this is debilitative, this is impacting my life. And sometimes that's really clear, but sometimes you kind of fall in this range of like, I don't know if this is a problem or if this is normal. And that's because we've been told over and over and over that whatever we experience is normal, or it's in our head, or we just have to deal with it. Like, you're welcome to womanhood, right? Or welcome to this like experience of menstruating. And that can create a lot of gaslighting, not only systemically, but we can internalize that as well. As like, well, maybe it's not as bad as I think, especially if you're having these like good days or these good weeks and you're like, but it might, but I'm fine some of the time, like maybe it's not as bad. And I think there's a couple ways to kind of get some clarity on like, okay, is this as bad as it feels in the moment? Because we can create such a disassociation from those bad days that it's kind of hard when we're not in it to really connect the dots, or to give it the weight and kind of the respect that it deserves. So some of the ways that are helpful to identify like, okay, is this worse? Is this like next level? Is noticing like how it's reflected back to you by people in your life, by family, by partners. Just be some insight of like, oh, like they seem to be telling me that I'm not okay, or that it's different, or that it's more extreme. And that always isn't always presented in a kind way, and maybe it's been thrown at you like in really negative ways, but seeing that pattern that has played out in your interpersonal relationships can be a clue. But I have also created a quiz to help that is actually looking at what is the internal subjective experience, what does it sound like in my head when it's PMDD versus PMS, because so much of PMS also gets a bad rap because we just aren't taught how to appreciate and be with the different phases of our cycle and how that changes our mood, our appetite, our energy levels, what we care about, what our priorities are. And so anything that isn't, the overachiever, people pleasing, like version that the world wants us to be all the time often gets pathologized or um, is sort of kind of talked about in such a negative way that we treat it like something's wrong with us when in fact it's like, no, it's normal to have a dip in your social energy. It's normal to feel a little bit more irritable to expectations that others place on us when we're heading into our period. So there's like a normal amount of fluctuation in that. And then there's like a more intense version that is a clue that this is not PMS. So now let's talk a little bit about hormone imbalances and how those are different and kind of how to navigate that portion of this. So like I said at the beginning, a hormone imbalance is the body producing too little or too much of a specific hormone versus like a reaction to the hormone. So this is where we kind of get on that PMS spectrum and say like, okay, now this seems more than like a normal shift in mood and appetite and things. This is feeling a little bit more intense, or maybe you're seeing your cycle disappear or be really sporadic or be really heavy, or, like those kind of more obvious signs that there's a gynecological issue, present. And this is where testing can be helpful. It can give you that insight. However, I just want to take a note on testing here because I think that testing is overdone in general and can sometimes be helpful and sometimes kind of leave us feeling worse off than had we not pursued like the testing. Part of this is because in Western medicine, it is like an intervention based model. So when it's looking at a range of normal, it's looking at this average across a lot of people. And as a society, like our hormones we're in a hormone epidemic, right? So on average, everyone is doing worse than they used to be. So this normal is less informative. It's also really looking at like, do you need hormone replacement like to function and to live? Like it's more like life death type spectrum, meaning it's very wide. If you are working with a functional medicine provider, they are often going to be working with a range that is much more geared towards like what is the optimal amount of this hormone to have, as opposed to like, are you dying type approach. So I think that's really important to know. And it just allows you to be more empowered because so often people go to get tested, it comes back normal and they're like, okay, but I feel horrible. And it can create, again, this like gaslighting type experience, whether that's overtly happening with a medical provider or sort of an internal thing of like, okay, well, they're saying I'm fine, but I don't feel fine and I don't know what to believe. So anytime we're going into a testing, like checking that kind of intention there of like, are you looking to be validated or are you wanting to do tests so that you can, rule out some things and just have some clarity, right? Because what does it mean if the test comes back normal? And I think this is often a question that we don't think about and don't really plan for until we get those like normal results. And then you're like, okay, but something's wrong. And that can feel really tough. So I do want to say within my coaching practice, testing is not within the scope of that. I don't do that as part of my programs. So I will link that quiz in the show notes for you to go and take a look at because I think it just really helps like give you that inside look and help you see those differences and, kind of make those connections for yourself if the formal criteria is not necessarily clear enough. I can refer people out for that if that's something they want because there is a place for testing. However, I think testing our estrogen and progesterone levels and things, so often we can get that information from just tracking our cycles, from looking at biomarkers like our basal body temperature, cervical fluid, like a lot of information is just available to us to kind of see like, oh, I'm not ovulating. There's our root problem, right? Where like testing doesn't necessarily need to be the way you go to get those answers. However, I do think testing can be really helpful in ruling out some sort of key hormone things, such as like thyroid issues, because no amount of like supporting your menstrual cycle and all of these things are going to like eradicate issues that are just like, oh, your thyroid isn't functioning. And you may need medication in those instances to get your thyroid working or to be on a specific protocol for that. Other things are looking at like vitamins and minerals, like often there's anemia or iron deficiencies, and it's like getting on an iron supplement, especially if you have a really heavy flow, can solve some of those fatigue issues and kind of deal with some of those problems in a really like streamlined way. So I think there's definitely a place for testing in the process, but what I advocate most for is testing from an empowered place, as opposed to looking towards the medical system or these experts to validate what you already know to be true in your body, which is like, this is it, I'm not feeling good, and like trusting your body in that it needs support. And so that's why my practice is built on this embodiment first, connection to self approach first, so that we're stepping into these situations empowered and it feels like alignment. It feels like, no, I want to see this data. I want to get full panels. I just want an idea of the full picture. And that will feel really good for me versus like this will feel demoralizing and overwhelming and like a ton of pressure, because none of those things are going to support you in healing. And so the last question here that I want to address today is this idea of like, can it be both? Can you have a hormone imbalance and have PMDD? And the answer to that is you absolutely could. They are not mutually exclusive. And also when we talk about hormone imbalances, sometimes hormone imbalances have to do with cortisol or, like I said, the thyroid hormones. And so you could have PMDD and a cortisol issue or a thyroid issue. And so you have an imbalance and you have PMDD. If it's an imbalance in reproductive hormones like estrogen or progesterone, which is usually an issue with ovulation, then I wouldn't immediately go to like getting a formal diagnosis of PMDD if those hormone imbalances are present. And so if those are present, if you're not ovulating, if your cycles are incredibly long or sporadic, your body's already showing you that like your cycle is not functioning optimally. Obviously, if this is the start of perimenopause, those changes are no longer within this range of like a pathological change, but like you can still, this is still a sign that your body may need some extra support, right? So we can take all of that information from our body and work with that. So that would be like the goal first. If there's reproductive hormone imbalances, like the first goal is like, let's get our body ovulating again, functioning again. Like that's really where the support would be focused before any sort of like need to put a label of PMDD on it. I think there's another piece that's relevant to this in terms of like hormone imbalances and PMDD and the relationship between them is because the sensitive periods for PMDD to emerge are often when hormones are not at their most stable. Okay, so the prime sensitive windows that PMDD emerges is during puberty, postpartum, post-pill, and in perimenopause. Now, besides post-pill, in all of these other sensitive windows, so puberty, postpartum, perimenopause, these are also sensitive in terms of brain development, okay, and brain rewiring. So in all of these situations, our brain is undergoing major changes, which means that the way that our body is then interacting and metabolizing our hormones can also get disrupted or change in those windows. In puberty and postpartum, it's the body's like attempts to start ovulating again. In perimenopause, it's sort of the downregulation of that, but the body's still making attempts, right? So hormones are not in the same like even distribution as they would be during like core reproductive years. But you have both going on. You have hormones fluctuating, you have brain changes happening. And so there can be this overlap in PMDD symptoms emerging while also having hormone imbalances going on. But again, I think that when we're trying to navigate these things, it's like if you're not ovulating, if your cycles are erratic or non-existent, if you're having these very obvious cycle issues, then we're really looking towards that hormone imbalance as a way to just orient like what's the goal. The goal is to get our body ovulating again, to get the right levels of hormones happening. And then if our cycles are regular, our cycles are pretty stable, and like there's no issues, overt issues there, but we're having these extreme emotional and cognitive symptoms around that luteal phase, then, we may be looking as like the label of PMDD is helpful as like our guiding, markers. But as far as like the work that I do with all of these things, in either case, it's an embodiment first approach. It's how do we connect to ourselves? It's how do we tap into our body's wisdom and our intuition and the signals it's giving us of what those first steps are. So the approach is not different in either of these cases. It's really about like what are going to be, the first action steps that we take and what feels right. What's the right version of those for you? So I hope this has been helpful in understanding what PMDD is as opposed to PMS and hormone imbalances. And I definitely would encourage you to take the quiz that I created that's going to give you an insight more into the subjective, like internal experience of it, and use that alongside the DSM criteria to get an idea of, one, does this fit your symptoms? And two, to help give you an idea of like, do you want to pursue a formal diagnosis, or is it enough to have that awareness and you're just like, okay, now what do I do? Now, what are the action steps that I can take to help relieve these symptoms and thrive more in my experience?